Hello, my name is Robin Webster. I'm a partner of Cameron Webster Architects in Glasgow and past president of the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland. Welcome to the Building Stories Talk. This is a series where we celebrate RIBA award-winning buildings and invite the architects to share their experiences. We can all learn from seeing the careful thought, imagination, and hard work that goes into these projects, whatever their scale. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Anna McLuckie from Chapman Architects and Peter Lee. Oh, hi, here's Anna. Great. And Peter Lee from Carmody Groarke. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Robin. Hi, everyone.
They're going to be showing and telling us about their award-winning projects in Glasgow, in Scotland, the Egg Shed and the Hill House Box. Please do send in your questions at any time on the Q&A session later. Send in your questions on the chat. The aim of the Egg Shed was to improve the Ardrishaig waterfront and create a heritage hub, working with their client, Scottish Canals. Anna and the team at Oliver Chapman transformed a historic building into a bespoke interpretation and visitor centre, telling the story of the Crinan Canal and the communities. Let's pass on over to Anna to take over on the story.
Thank you, Robin. Hi, everyone. My name is Anna and I work for Oliver Chapman Architects, OCA, in Edinburgh. And I was project architect for our Egg Shed project for Scottish Canals, which is a community and visitor centre which is located in the village of Ardrishaig in the west coast of Scotland. As you can see from this photo, the building sits right on the edge of Loch Gilp, and it also incorporates the masonry shell of an existing building on the site. And we took this simple pitched form of the existing building and extended it as a template across the new volume, which is moored up against the existing one. So a bit of background to our practice. OCA is a small practice. We're currently 6 people based in the heart of Edinburgh's Old Town, and we work on projects across Scotland and beyond. We enjoy working on a variety of scales and a variety of different typologies. We work with community groups, we've worked with social housing, private houses, master planning, and public buildings such as the Egg Shed. So Ardrishaig is not too far from Edinburgh as the crow flies. However, due to the fragmented geography of Scotland's west coast, it actually takes over 4 hours to get there by public transport, which resulted in some quite lengthy days while the project was on site. The village grew up around the eastern end of the Crinan Canal, which was constructed in the early 19th century and built to connect the fishing grounds of the Atlantic with Scotland's central belt. And Ardrishaig, the settlement really capitalised on this new link as in its earliest incarnation as a fishing village. The village runs in a linear fashion along the canal and along Loch Gilp, and here you can see the Egg Shed perched right on the edge of the loch. It's just north of Pier Square, which is the historic heart of the village, and the historic harbour to the south. In the early stages of the project, we undertook quite a lot of research into the site, and with the help of the local community, we began to uncover the history of this masonry building. Its construction appears to coincide with the peak of the fishing industry in Ardrishaig, so around the start of the 20th century. And this 1904 map from Scottish Canals archive shows the harbour with Telford's breakwater and the pier. And the existing masonry building is this form here, which is noted as a barking house. Barking is the process by which fishing nets would be immersed in a hot liquid preservative brewed from tree bark to increase their longevity. So at high tide, the fishing boats would be moored up against the building, the nets taken inside, they would go through this process and then taken further up the hill where they would be dried on the stances, which were essentially kind of like large washing lines. And so at this point in its construction, the building really had this dual aspect. It engaged both with the loch and with the land. And below here we can see this old photo shows a paddle steamer, and at this point the paddle steamers would run between Glasgow and Ardrishaig to take visitors on a tour up to Ardrishaig and then along the Crinan Canal. So at this point we're already seeing the convergence of tourism and industry. Here's another photo we came across which shows what are potentially a catch of basking sharks. And you can see the egg shed building and the stances in the background. With the decline of the fishing industry in Ardrishaig post the Second World War, the building was used for a while as transit storage for eggs and dairy, which was en route from the Mid-Argyll farms down to the Central Belt. And it's this use in the 50s and 60s that members of the local community really remember and which gave it its name, the egg shed. With the increased use of motor transport, the site was leased for oil storage and the egg shed building fell into disrepair. Our involvement in the site really began in 2016 when we led a series of community design workshops with Scottish Canals and the local government. And these were looking at the future of the settlements along the Crinan Canal. The local community identified the egg shed site as an area that they were very keen to see redeveloped and to see something happen with. So this is the site in 2016. We've got Pier Square here in the corner and the village extends north. And this site is really prominent and it sits as a barrier between the two different parts of the village. The approach to the village is actually right round the head of Loch Gilp, so the site is incredibly visible from all around. So from the design workshops, we had identified a site, but no real brief. And we worked with Scottish Canals to develop the brief. This is a sketch from the design workshops, which shows the site here and suggests some possible uses for it, everything ranging from workshop space, food and drink offer, visitor facilities, to commercial and office use. The client was keen to move forward quickly with the construction and to maintain the impetus generated by the community workshops and the enthusiasm that was for the project that was within the local community. The timescales of funders already on board meant that we were kind of still fine-tuning the brief while we were going through the planning and stage 3. And so this kind of results in looking at a variety of different uses. The one shown here is how the building might function as a restaurant, but this was ultimately rejected by the funders. They didn't want to fund this use. So that led Scottish Canals to settle on the idea of a heritage interpretation centre with a community space. So what we have here, we have the existing egg shed building, which houses the community space, and the new volume, which houses the exhibition and interpretation and retail areas. And these are linked by a central facilities core. And it was really important that the building was incredibly flexible so that different parts could be shut off while different parts are still able to operate, or that it could operate as a whole, with the community space becoming perhaps a temporary exhibition space in conjunction with the main space. So the site provided several design challenges for us, not least its former use as an oil storage site. The defunct apparatus was removed, and we had this legacy of contamination to contend with some former oil spills. And the location of the existing building right up against the tidal sea loch also provided some issues with flood risk, and we had detailed discussions with the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency about flood mitigation measures. And you can also see in this photograph the evidence of the bricked up doorways from its previous use as a barking house. So this is the egg shed today. Our approach to the design was really to view this as the next chapter in the building's history. It's a practical, functional building, and the traces of its story and its previous uses are clearly visible in the building fabric. So our approach was really more focused on maintaining the spirit of the building rather than being particularly precious about the existing structure. And we therefore made some bold new openings to open it up to the loch, and we used this bold orange colour to identify the new areas of construction. This shows the extent of the land raising that we undertook, and this was a strategy that we adopted both as a flood protection and to cap the contaminated ground. So this is the gas and waterproof membrane before the slab's laid, and we also applied a liquid membrane to the existing walls. So in these sections, you can see the dashed line here shows the level of the existing ground pre the start of the works and how it was raised both within the building and externally to create a level access route. And we can see here the openings to either side of the masonry building to allow the kind of dual aspect of it to connect with both the loch and the land. So in addition to the land raising works, the first metre of construction is made of flood resilient materials. So that's site cast concrete within the new volume and the use of block work within the existing building where the existing walls provide some structural stability. We've changed this to a lighter timber structure above this datum, which is more cost effective and sustainable. We also had to look at the resilience of the materials that we were specifying externally. Red cladding was a key design decision that we made early on. It echoes the kind of traditional vernacular of Scottish industrial buildings, and it also creates an eye-catching landmark which can be viewed from across the loch and on approach to the town, marking the building as a destination. So the external cladding had to be suitable for the harsh coastal conditions. It's a very exposed site, and so it was carefully selected to be robust. We examined a range of materials, initially looking at fibre cement, which is what's shown in this early stage model, and then looking at pigmented zinc and colour-coated steel, balancing the colour, performance, cost and sustainability. And we eventually selected the green coat steel for its kind of balance of these things. It can be fully recycled at the end of its use, and it has a long lifespan. So internally, the flood resistance datum is expressed with this micro cement, which is on the walls and floors, and it contrasts with the lighter structure above, while the exposed ceiling structure reflects and refines the industrial vernacular. This is the community space, which is used for a variety of activities by the local community, temporary exhibitions, yoga, meetings, film nights, and here we can see how we've opened it up to give the spectacular views across the loch and really give a new experience of the building right on the edge of the elements. Within the exhibition space, the exhibition focuses on the natural industrial history of the Mid-Argyll area and the canal, and it also provides an orientation to the area for visitors to guide them on to other points of interest and attractions. We worked closely with exhibition designers 4x2 to create interactive exhibits which encourage engagement with the surroundings, like you can see here, with encouraging people to look at the loch, look at the surrounding buildings, the views over the loch, and there's also views south over the timber pier and boatyard, which help provide physical context to the interpretation. The displays were designed to be fully movable. This is to give maximum flexibility to the building, and also in the event of a flood, everything can be moved out of the building. So the project holistically aims to meet the aims identified by the community back in 2016. We've opened up the site, so it's now fully accessible to the public, creating a new linkage to Pier Square in the south, and opening up views across the loch. It works as a destination and a community space. As part of the scope of the works, we also undertook some refurbishment works at Pier Square, creating a new office for Scottish Canals within one of the heritage buildings. And we also oversaw the installation of a community pontoon to further allow the community to engage with their waterfront. However, this is just the first stage in Scottish Canal's ambitions for the site. The idea is that the Eggshed project will work as a catalyst for future development, extending into the north site, where the majority of the oil storage apparatus formerly was, and connecting up with waterside paths to the north, as well as Pier Square to the south. The overall master plan aims to create new views and routes throughout Ardrishaig and bring the community back in touch with the waterfront. Since opening in summer 2019, the community have really taken ownership of the building. They've really adopted the community space for a variety of uses, and they've also fed into the exhibits and interpretation material, which has become a real local archive. Within this egg-shaped sculptural booth, we've recorded spoken records of anecdotes and memory from members of the local community, which echo around the space and provide a really immersive experience. The aspiration was to create a space that will evolve with the needs of the community. It's not a fixed exhibition, and it will change over time. So the Eggshed works on creating a distinctive form, utilising the form of the existing building and extending this out for the 21st century and creating a new interface between the village and its waterfront. Hi there.
Right. Hi. Thank you very much, Anna. That's brilliant, actually. I've got a few questions from the people watching, but I've got one question for myself. Really was the big oil drum, the oil capacity stuff is gone now. Are you actually involved in creating that route to the north, and is that actually going to happen?
Absolutely. So as part of our original project, we actually did some land raising in that area in preparation for the kind of phase 2 of the project. And certainly there's been a bit of a hiatus, as with all things, from COVID, but certainly the aspiration is still very much there, and the impetus is definitely there in the community to extend that route on.
Yeah, good. That's good news. I got some questions also from the audience. Ella asked, what was the methodology you used for the community consultations? How did you do?
The community consultations, it was over a 4-day period. We had sun, we had rain, we had hail, and we still had incredible engagement from the community. It was under the Scottish Government's Charette programme, which was running at that time. And basically it involved intense workshops, talking about the different areas, talking about what the community liked, didn't like, talking about, what resources there were in the community and how we can build on those. So it was about walking around the village, walking around the canal with umbrellas, pointing things out, working out how connections could be made, and then going back into village halls to sit round and discuss people's thoughts. And it really generated, a lot of ideas and, a lot of enthusiasm for the project.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of other very quick questions. One is, what were the windows? What sort of windows did you use?
So the windows are Technal, and we worked very carefully with them to ensure, because obviously in this very exposed location right on the edge of the waterfront, and we worked really closely with the project representatives there to ensure that they were going to be suitable for that location. And
that was from Sarah. And then a last question from Hannah. Is there anything that you would improve or want to change now that you've built it with hindsight?
I think we actually made, it wasn't a kind of stuck in stone project, as it were. We were still kind of developing things as it went on site, which I'm sure is the same with many projects. Certainly to do with kind of sustainability now, we have the air source heat pump, but I feel like we could bring in some further sustainability measures. It's a very sustainable building and it does have good ratings, but I feel like particularly looking towards net zero, that's something we would want to bring into the project if we were doing it today.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. I'll be asking Anna to join us later But now over to our next guest, Peter Lee. The Hill House box is a large structure that encases one of the most important and the most beautiful buildings of the Scottish architect Charles Rennie Mackintosh. For the publisher Walter Blackie, it was built in 1902, and the new shed is designed to protect the building while it undergoes conservation work. I'm going to hand over to Peter now to tell us all about it. Peter.
Thanks, Robin. So many thanks to the RIBA for the invitation to speak today about our project at Charles Rennie Mackintosh's Hill House in Helensburgh. So the project is set within the context of the second devastating fire that has all but ruined Charles Rennie Mackintosh's masterpiece at the Glasgow School of Art, which I guess in part is a reminder of the fragility of architecture and it's constantly at the mercy of the effects of time, of weathering and decay, of use and misuse, and it's compelled to a constant state of transformation. So while the Mac has been devastatingly damaged, our project is concerned with the opportunity to experience Mackintosh's genius with another of his buildings, which has been at critical risk until very recently. So this is, of course, his residential masterpiece, Hill House, probably one of the most important 20th century buildings in Scotland and the UK, which was suffering a different fate. After 115 years of driving rain, it was dissolving like an aspirin to the point where it was rotting from the inside and close to being beyond repair. So the house is located in Helensburgh, about 20 miles northwest of Glasgow, on the west coast of Scotland. Helensburgh grew from the advent of the railways in Victorian times and the middle class commuting away from overcrowded industrialised Glasgow. Helensburgh itself has a fascinating history, which could be subject to a separate lecture in itself, but Hill House is located at the very limit of the 19th century town plan, not unlike Glasgow itself, with a very strong gridiron plan, certainly from the very heart of the town, spreading out before more recent developments somewhat eroded that. But it's a strategic location at the very highest point of Helensburgh, and creating a belvedere to look out over the town and connecting the houses' interiors to the expansive landscape beyond. So this is a view from the top of the hill, stood beside the entrance to Hill House, looking back to the River Clyde and the industrial Greenock beyond. So at the turn of the century, the Clyde was bringing ideas every day into Glasgow from across the world, and it was from these influences that Mackintosh drew many inspirations. The house is an imaginative composition of forms, blending references of Scottish baronial architecture with emerging modernism from Eastern and Southern Europe. Encapsulating all of these references is a stiff concrete render, or harling, buttered over the top of the walls and parapets to create an image that is simultaneously abstract and figurative. The rather austere exterior belies the rich interiors with a radical organisation, spatial progression and intricate detailing embedding the rich stylistic references, all designed bespoke around the patterns of living for the client publisher Walter Blackie and his family. So designed with Margaret MacDonald, the house was designed to the specifics of the Blackie family, creating some of the most significant interiors of the 20th century. However, the signs of prolonged water damage were severe, certainly when we became involved in the project, and scholars had debated for 40 years on what best to do with the house. This is an image taken a week before the house finally closed to visitors before the construction. The photograph almost belies the seriousness of the deterioration the house was suffering because of a fundamental construction fault that was simultaneously at the heart of Mackintosh's concept of abstracting so many stylistic references into one external composition, made coherent with the use of one overall material. So the root of the problem, in many ways, is the way the house was built from local sandstone and brick. Partly as a stipulation from the local quarry owner, who sold the Blackies the plot of land, that they had to use the stone from his quarry, which was unsuitable for construction, really. And this was coupled with Mackintosh's abstraction of traditional detailing with window sills, lintels, and drips, simplified to a single cement-based harling surface wrapping around all these details. With the stone being buttered, with a very strong cement-based harling render, the water gets in behind the concrete render, it freezes, the render cracks, more water gets in and doesn't get out, and the cycle continues. This is particularly manifest at parts of the building which are most vulnerable to the weather, such as here in the very top of the parapets at the top of the building. So in 2017, the National Trust for Scotland ran an international architectural competition to run alongside a conservation programme. The idea was to fully scaffold the house, whilst the visitors' pavilion would provide an experience of Macintosh on the garden lawn in front of it. We disagreed with the premise of this idea from several points of view, but fundamentally that quarantining the project for up to 15 years of repair would make people lose interest in coming to the house. However, since the beginning of our studio, we've been captivated by temporary projects, and indeed projects using scaffolding and the potential to build quickly and the habit itself. But we knew this wouldn't be a scaffolding project. If one looks at the impacts of scaffolding structures, temporary works are extremely dense. The scaffold on the photo on the left is the emergency safety works around the Glasgow School of Art 1 week after the fire, and it's around 10 metres deep. A similar technique applied to Hill House would have decimated the garden landscape, as well as obscuring the house from view indefinitely, like the example on the right, which is Castle Drogo by Edwin Lutyens, which was built a very similar time to Hill House. And this was a few years ago during its extensive re-roofing across the building. So these diagrams summarize the difference in approaches between temporary and permanent structure. On the left, temporary structure, on the right, a permanent structure. And although the box that we've designed over Hill House is a temporary intervention, it's got an undefined lifespan. So by using permanent construction techniques, it can remain in place as long as required and be an overall lower cost over the lifespan of the project to the client. So the architectural idea was to create an enclosure that created a solid roof, which keeps the rain off, supported by a skeleton of steel. Inside the skeleton, we introduce the visitors' facilities of tickets, cafe and toilets, and some walkways that allow you to explore the house in new and unusual ways during the conservation works. The idea of a field hospital to take care of the patient inside. A temporary structure that could give immediate protection to the house, to stop the clock and halt decay, and buy time to think about what best to do next. This is a project by Huis Rucker in 1971, which creates a similar idea of a hermetic environment around Mies van der Rohe's Crefeld Villas, which starves the architecture of daylight and context. However, we rather see the project more like Cedric Price's Fun Palace, where the subject is the interactivity of visitors and the structure within. So the architectural idea is about putting the visitors at the center of the experience of conservation, and then creating a very special enclosure around the perimeter. The result is the house becomes a museum object itself, visible from an array of viewpoints from both high and low and right over the top of it. So to achieve the structure of the house, we look to simple and straightforward methods of construction, and perhaps the most ubiquitous method of making efficient large structures and bolted steel connections. With the directness of these methods of construction and the peculiarities that come from the site specifics, creating an interest and beauty, a matter-of-factness is almost inarguable about the end result. Here we see the first corner of the structure being erected, very much in keeping with the idea of that pylon technology. So we understood and knew that the solid roof would deal with the vast majority of rainfall onto the building, which is substantial in this location, high on the hill, bearing the brunt of the weather from the Atlantic. The vertical surfaces needed to prevent driven rain and also allow the required airflow to dry the building. So following an extensive research, the walls themselves are actually a membrane of stainless steel chainmail woven into 43 million links. This chainmail catches driving rain and allows wind to pass through and slowly dry out the building. The material literally is like medieval chainmail, and it's made for various industrial processes and equipment, but we understand this is the largest architectural building or use of it in the world. So the mesh allows views out from inside the box back out towards the Clyde, and the mesh really does allow kind of remarkably clear views. So here's partway through into construction. So the left-hand side is the mesh. On the right-hand side, there is no mesh with it allowing clear view through it. And that sort of acts as a counterpoint of the robust steel structure and the almost filigree nature of the mesh itself. So unequally as a kind of counterpoint, the mesh is sort of painstakingly stitched together by hand in a very sort of delicate manner, as you can see on the left, between the panels, which again sort of contrasts with the robust steelwork construction. This had the happy coincidence of actually allowing, well, creating slightly reduced light levels, which meant that the conservation blinds within the house itself could be lifted for the first time in many years, and allow the kind of direct connection between the interiors and the outside. So the mesh allows views of the hill house also from standing outside the structure. And it has a very unusual presence, I guess, created by the frame-like structure and the filigree wall, sort of in complete counterpoint to the mass and solidity of the hill house inside. And the chainmail itself has a almost magical quality as well, of being both transparent and opaque when viewed obliquely. And it acts as a constantly changing appearance through the day, through the seasons, as the sun and rain fall differently on the surface, creating an almost ethereal appearance at times. The box is incredibly pure in its separation of primary structure and cladding, and avoids typical cladding rails and secondary structure found in most buildings, almost in the spirit of Mackintosh's original abstraction of the house's hireling and construction details. Within the box, the landscape has continued to grow while the decay of the house is stopped, and it slowly dries out from inside its southern interior. And as with the original objective of the whole project, the box is working and the house is drying out. It's being monitored by Historic Environment Scotland, who are pleased with the slow rate of drying, which is gently reducing the damaging moisture without causing any adverse effects. The walkways wrap all of the house, giving the visitors 360-degree views of unseen areas of Mackintosh's masterpiece from all different angles. And this image also shows quite clearly the fittings in the box, which are very carefully arranged to avoid impacting the landscape, which is part of the original Mackintosh design, and ensuring that on the completion, the whole box can be dismantled, and then the whole landscape put back to its original design. So the walkways provide views of the house which had never previously been seen. And as the conservation works progress, visitors will be able to view that conservation work progressing and return and see different elements of the house being conserved and the works progressing towards their completion. The walkways also bearing the sort of very basic and primal excitement of being up high on an adventure, which has been part of the reason the house has now attracted a much younger audience, with family visits in particular significantly increasing. The views are spectacular from this vantage point, with the Isle of Arran visible on a good day off into the distance. So since reopening, the annual visitor numbers have increased fourfold on the pre-COVID numbers. And by buying time to consider what to do with the ensuing repairs, they also have a new dilemma about whether the box itself should stay forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. That is brilliant. It is the most exciting, actually. And when I first learned what was going to happen, I had severe doubts. But having been there a number of times, I'm actually captivated by it. It shows the building in a way was never possible previously. And my first question was, do you think it may actually be permanent? Because it's obviously very popular, and indeed it takes things out of the house, like the cafe and things, which were really actually sort of severely sort of squashed in the house before, which and it releases the house to be, as it was, a home for the Blackies. Do you think it will be permanent, or is
well, I suppose when it was originally built, all through design, there was no intention that it would be permanent. It was always going to be a temporary element there. But I guess the longer it's been there, more people seem to be becoming fond of it. And yeah, I think whenever we go, that certainly the staff there don't want it to come down. Lots of visitors don't want it to come down. So I don't know. Maybe there's an increasing groundswell of support for it to stay.
Well, the fact of the matter is that Mackintosh was following advice at the time, no doubt, but was mistaken about the way that Portland cement render would perform. And it the fact of the matter is that if you did take it away, in another 25 years, you'd have to put it back, wouldn't you? I mean,
yeah, well, I mean, I think this is part of the success. I think from the National Trust perspective is it's kind of opened up this conversation about conservation and what is the right approach. You know, and I think one conservation approach, you know, as you suggest there, Robin, is, you know, that you would reinstate the house exactly as Macintosh had designed it with the Portland cement solution. But whether that's the right thing to do when you know you're reinstating a flawed approach, essentially, and you're going to have to return to that in a number of years, you know, or should the approach be to use a different material, which might be better suited, again, but that wouldn't be in the as per the original intention of Macintosh, or you know, I think there's a number of options there that which are part of that debate, and I think that's part of the, you know, as the National Trust remit is to preserve the heritage of Scotland for Scotland, that having these discussions and not having them sort of opening them up to the public is something that they're very keen on and delighted about, that this sort of allows people to engage in that process, and you know, allows people, when the conservation works happen, to actually start seeing that up close and personal, and you know, hopefully, you know, even engage with the people doing the actual work itself as well, because they're only 1.5 meters away potentially from them as they're walking around on the walkways.
Yeah.
So it's just a different experience, and I think trying to develop ideas of visitor experiences which are beyond just looking at a static fixed object.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it leads me to a question that's been put from the floor, which is, has there been any dialogue about this conservation approach at Hill House to the Glasgow School of Art? I mean, which has obviously got rather different problems, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, there have been some, you know, high level in principle discussions with them. You know, I think during the process, the first fire had happened and the second one hadn't actually happened as we were doing the main design of the process. You know, I think during the process there was a lot of engagement with various experts and interested parties who are incredibly knowledgeable about Macintosh and you know, the constructional techniques and approaches within that, who I guess tend to be equally across Hill House and across the School of Architecture or School of Art. So yes, there's been dialogue. I'm not sure either are particularly leading one way. You know, they are very different buildings in themselves, but I think very much so it's an ongoing process and discussion.
One further question from John was, how does the mesh actually provide water protection? I was very interested to learn that actually the size of the mesh allows a bumblebee in but keeps the water out. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, so, well, I suppose in essence, the mesh keeps the water out by, when the rain is driving and being blown by the wind, it hits a solid part of the mesh, and once it hits the mesh, then it has its kind of horizontal momentum taken out of it, and it essentially falls downwards, is the principles, I suppose, behind it. So, I mean, we did a number of tests. The mesh, the manufacturer of it, they do it in a whole variety of different sizes of rings, so from very small to actually much bigger than we have. We settled the one that we've got, which is 10 millimeters in diameter. And by the time you've got these sort of overlocking elements, they're not necessarily, the gap is actually smaller. So it's that driving rain that actually hits the mesh, and it falls downwards essentially. And given the size of a water droplet, that well, the theory was that would work, and I think the evidence from the Historic Environment Scotland suggests that definitely is working.
Thanks very much. I'd like to bring Anna back in now, actually. Hi, Anna. Thank you very much indeed, Peter. That was terrific. I've got one question for both of you, which was, were there any other conservation projects that you're working on now? Anna, are you working on a conservation project now?
Yeah, we are. So based in the centre of Edinburgh, in the UNESCO World Heritage Site, there's always a conservation project to work on, or so it seems. At the moment, we're working on a domestic project, which is for Tweeddale Court. It's one of the, it dates back from the 16th century, and it's one of the original townhouses that was built in the old town. And we're looking, it's been office use for a number of years, but we're looking at bringing the upper floors back into domestic use, which is really interesting, as that's obviously the, the original purpose of the building, and kind of reopening it back to that. Obviously challenges related to it, related to how, the building's been changed over the years, and how a house was built in the 16th century might not be quite suitable for 21st century living, but certainly an interesting project.
Peter, are you applying this system to any other buildings or any other approaches?
Well, I suppose not directly applying this approach. I think probably about 50% of our work is in listed buildings. So I guess projects that we're working on at the moment, we're working on a design museum in Ghent, in Belgium, in the heart of the UNESCO World Heritage Site. So extending an existing, 4 separate existing buildings from 4 different centuries, which have all been combined together, and we're building a new extension and connecting those together. We're also working on another museum in Manchester for the Science Museum, which involves the world's first passenger railway there as well. So there's quite a few more as well.
But there's nothing else. I mean, it's very brave of the National Trust, actually, I think, to propose. I mean, I think you were probably right to criticize their brief, but nonetheless, it is a very radical approach, but I think hugely successful. I won't be at all surprised if you're asked to do more to other buildings which are otherwise going to sort of dissolve or disappear. I hope so, anyway. It seems to me to be very successful. I had one other question for you, Peter, which I've omitted to ask, which was, did you ever think of colouring the steel rather than just leaving it with the galvanized? That was from John. I know. From Mark.
Well, we did. I think we did look at that. I think we didn't want the structure to sort of take over, I suppose, too much from the original house itself. And I think having the kind of silvery galvanized color, it helps to not take priority, I guess, over the existing house itself. I think also it's going to be an additional cost, etc., which for a temporary structure, we were always trying to give the best value to the client for that. And I guess that additional layer, which actually adds up to quite a large cost across the whole building, would have been quite hard to justify.
I've got one other question for both of you, which I think to a certain extent you've answered, Peter, but were there any technical issues with the building within the existing shell? So did you have problems with the existing building, Anna, that you had to deal with that you haven't covered?
I think it was quite challenging, certainly from a structural point of view, given that it's a building on essentially made ground, so ground that's been reclaimed from the sea, and just working on putting in the foundations that were required to support the new structure within that. We had to, do quite a lot of careful calculations with the engineers to work out, sizes of piling rigs, things like that could fit within the existing walls. And we're also very keen to ensure that they weren't just retained for decorative reasons, essentially. So we really wanted them to work as part of the structure, and they provide, a lot of bracing for the new internal timber structure that doesn't require quite as much wind loading. So it kind of works on 2 levels, I suppose.
Thank you. Peter, was there anything other than obviously the problems with the Portland cement render? Was there anything else that you had to face?
Well, I suppose in terms of our works, obviously, building on top and going on top of Hill House is a challenge in itself. So there were certain limitations along things like hot works permits. Well, there was no hot works essentially being allowed, and I think just the challenge of craning some 30-meter beams on top of the house itself was a bit of a nerve-wracking moment, certainly for the first couple. But once those first few went up and the roof got on top, then yeah, it was a little bit less nerve-wracking.
Well, look, thank you both very much indeed. It was really fascinating. Two very, very different buildings. In fact, I don't think that I was chairing the awards committee, and we had some difficulty comparing. It's sort of like comparing apples and oranges in some ways, but they're both remarkable. So thank you, Anna McLuckie from Oliver and Chapman and Peter Lee from Carmody Groarke. Sorry. We have another extremely interesting building stories in-person event coming up on Tuesday, the 12th of July. It's the series finale, and it's Shelley McNamara and Yvonne Farrell of Grafton Architects will be joining us on site to talk about their 2021 Sterling Prize winner at the Trust House at Kingston University. So do join us for what promises to be a bit of a party there, and a rather wonderful venue. Sign up for the tickets. There'll be a link in the chat for you to do that. So the Building Service Stories lunchtime digital talks will be back in September, at the end of September, when we will be featuring more talks about the 2022 award-winning architects. So thank you very much indeed, Peter and Anna, and everybody else for joining. Goodbye.